record this computer. That would probably break my computer. So we've got 28 people online, so it's a good number of people. If I can introduce myself, I'm Richard Gray, and I'm the Research Focus Area Director for the Building Healthy Communities RFA. By way of ground rules, just to let you know that we're recording this. If you've got a microphone on, could you turn it off, put it on mute, except for Catherine, because if Catherine puts her microphone on mute, we are seriously limited in terms of what we can learn. I think consumer involvement in research is a really important issue, and I suspect it's an issue that's likely to become even more important. It's important for important reasons, but it's important for getting grant reasons. Catherine is a research fellow in the Department of Social Work and Social Policy at the Trobe, and it is a kind of consumer researcher. And her work's informed by her own experiences of mental illness and recovery, as well as her experiences as a community mental health worker. What else can I say about Catherine? So Catherine recently completed her role as a consumer academic in the Recovery and Social Justice Unit at the Centre for Mental Health at the University of Melbourne. So lucky escape to come to La Trobe. That's a very good move. Catherine has demonstrated that she can complete compelling pieces of social research and service evaluation using her unique combination of perspectives, lived experience, industry practice, and research. And the most interesting thing about Catherine is that she can complete a Rubik Cube in 2 minutes. And I recall I'm old enough to remember when Rubik Cubes came out, and I thought I'd achieve something if I managed to get 2 sides that looked the same. So I'm slightly distressed that there is apparently a formula and you can learn it. But Catherine, if I can hand over to you, Catherine will talk if people have got questions. Please kind of write those questions in the chat box, and then I can invite questions for discussion towards the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Catherine, can I hand over to you?
Thanks, Richard, and thank you for the kind introduction. It's lovely to be here today, and it's very, very, very encouraging as someone with lived experience to see that so many people have taken time out of their day to come and learn more about how we can increase consumer involvement in research. So as Richard said, I'm Catherine Mitchell. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in social work and social policy here at La Trobe in Bundoora. So I'd also just like to acknowledge that our discipline lead, who's my boss, Lisa Brophy, is also joining us today. And it's really important to acknowledge her because she's been instrumental in bringing lived experience researchers into La Trobe, and we can talk about that later. So here I am. Let me just minimize my screen so I can see my slides a little bit better. We'll go up one a bit more. So as Richard said, I'm an individual who has lived experience of mental illness, of service use, clinical service use, and research, and I've also worked in community mental health. So what I find is that I'm actually an individual who kind of moves between worlds. I have my academic work where I've recently completed my PhD. Now, as a consumer academic or as a researcher, I'm often not expected to undertake, it's often not expected that I undertake quantitative work, but having my social work background and my social work education, I didn't receive much quantitative education at that time. So this was around 2014. So I thought that it was really important for my research career and for my understanding of my topic to learn more about quantitative research. So I applied for and I received a competitive scholarship to complete a randomised control trial in which I included 173 stroke survivors and carers. This was also really important to me in terms of extending my practice, as it let me look at carers and it also let me look at individuals who were in the older stages of their life, because my participants were around 65 years old. I also have a background in Bachelor of Arts, where I majored in Cultural Studies. And if you're really savvy, you might pick up as we go along the fact that I am still an ardent post-structuralist, and that I specialise in things like representation, language, and construct. This fits really nicely with my social work practice, which is also about understanding constructs and systems. So in 2014, I completed my honours, and by that point, I'd been in social work practice for quite some time. I've always worked in drug and alcohol rehabs, but more of the time, so from 2007 to 2014, I actually worked in community mental health for Mind Australia. And during that time, I worked around a range of programs. So I had a really diverse set of practice experiences while I was there. So I worked with both youth and adult. I also worked in residential units, which we now know better as SILs, which is supported independent living facilities. I worked in complex care quite a lot, and I also worked in very specialised programs like that were addressing secu diversional. So for individuals who had such ongoing and such acute problems that they weren't able to live in the community, that they were actually living in the inpatient unit and often in high dependency for up to years at a time. So that's my background. And definitely, if you do make me mad, you will get my social worker voice, especially if you are another service and I feel that you are being unhelpful. That's definitely true. And I just wanted to bring home the fact as well that as I said, I'm often moved between worlds. So sometimes I'm an insider, sometimes I'm an outsider, oftentimes I'm an inside outsider, both at once. And it's just to start to flag the idea, and I see this coming up in practice more often, the fact that people are identifying as having increasingly hybrid identities. And I definitely fall into that category. So when you look at my I also work as a private consultant for Live Solutions. And when you look at my business card for that, what you'll see is that I'm a multi-perspective consultant. The dynamic that I'm often faced with having these multiple perspectives or knowledge bases or communities is about how to identify. One of the core things that I've always had in my practice is that I've always identified as an individual who has lived experience, and I've always spoken about that very openly. When we move through this, we'll start to look at the idea that there's not just that an individual doesn't just have an experience of mental illness or mental distress, but that there's an ongoing recovery journey that comes along with that as well. And even for individuals like myself who might not have had those more complex presentations for 10 or 15 years, there's an ongoing relationship with your recovery, and that's about your identity within yourself and what you think is possible for your life. And this is something that we'll look at as we go further through. So what I wanted to do, so one of the things that happens to me as an insider-outsider is that when I'm working with clinical will often forget that I have lived experience until I kind of slip in and talk about that stuff. And also I'm finding that with researchers, one of the great barriers or hurdles that I'm experiencing at the moment is around feeling comfortable and confident talking to an individual with lived experience about mental health and about their own lived experience. So something that happens to me very frequently is that I'll be talking to a researcher and then they'll get really, really excited because I'll be talking about outcome measures and all these great technical things, which is actually often something that we don't expect consumer academics to be interested in or to do. You know, bust that right here. And then all of a sudden I'll say something that reminds them that I also have lived experience and that I hold that position quite strongly. And you can see all these ideas happening in their head, and then their mouth just goes up and they stop talking. And for me, that's a problem. So what I want to do today, in the idea that we are forwarding this this involvement of between lived experience and research is to give ourselves just a little bit of a practice space where we can start practicing, even if it's imperfect, talking about lived experience and mental illness. The guidelines for this is that as long as you have benevolent intent, I'm okay if it comes out all wrong and we have to revise it as we go. We can practice and learn together, that's okay. What I want to do is give us a chance to learn to communicate together. And what's most important to me, even if you do a whoopsie or you feel silly, is that you just have a go, because it's the more that you can have a go at communicating in this space and listening and learning about how individuals with lived experience talk about themselves and about what they experience, the better your research is going to be. And maybe the more, hopefully, the more confident you feel kind of including lived experience. Look, my super tip for researchers who aren't confident or who might have come and not experienced a lot of consumer-based or lived experience-based discourse is always that when you work with individuals who have their own lived experience, you can just fess up and say, look, I'm really, really interested in this and I really want to be helpful to individuals who have these experiences, but I don't know how to talk about it yet. Is that something that we can work on as we go? And so that's what we're going to do today. Feel free to put in your comments and just have a go, and we can talk about things like assumptions and language as we move through. So originally Richard and I thought about the idea that as a university, what would it be that we would need to do so that we could have optimal consumer involvement at La Trobe? And the first thing that we would do is to make people like me into postdocs. So La Trobe is already leading the way in terms of identifying individuals who have strong research skills, who also sit very strongly and comfortably in their recovery journey, who are able to contribute to research in a very meaningful way. So that's already something that we're doing really, really strongly. So I'll give credit to Professor Lisa Brophy for that and for her mindfulness of including lived experience. And we'll look at that as well when we were working together at the University of Melbourne, when we look at an example later on. So it's about having all the right people. That might sound like a silly thing to say, but if we look at how this discourses have progressed, the scientific discourse and our clinical discourse has often marginalised, minimised or completely left out individuals who have lived experience. For me, this is a problem because if you don't talk to the individuals for whom you're trying to help, how will you understand and define your research problem effectively? And you might even end up deciding that there's a research problem to be solved when it could actually completely miss the point. So lived experience people are imperative the whole way through. It's also really important that we include carers, community members, employers. If we're looking at the peer support workforce, that we include their managers as well. So it's about getting everyone together and starting to have a mutual understanding and learning to, and you'll hear me talk about this a lot, learn to speak each other's language, understand each other's sensibilities, how we decide what's true and how we decide what's important, and allowing for a multiplicity of these perspectives. The next thing that we would need is to have all of the right supports. So this includes when we look at our workforce, our lived experience workforce, making sure that they have equity, so that they might have parity of pay, that they have the right leave. One of the things that I bang on about is the fact that we often give our lived experience workforce part-time EFT, and that full-time roles are very hard to come along. And I think that's an issue of equity, and that's a form of systematic disadvantage. So we need to make sure when we're involving people as researchers that we've got the right supports. This might include as well things like debriefing, the right contact information for support to go on your PICFs, and just a greater involvement. We'll talk about this more as we go along. The next thing that we need is all the right opportunities. So I would split this into two groups. From a researcher point of view, in terms of that I would want them a diversity of identified roles like my one at Melbourne University where I was a consumer academic, and then as well it's really important for individuals who have lived experience and are in research roles to have a chance to sit in more general or non-identified roles as well, so that it's easier for them to brand themselves and expand into other research topics as well. So, for example, I was aware that when I was a consumer academic, that one of the markets I was limiting myself towards was that it would be very difficult for me to go back into stroke and look more at stroke. So we're looking at all the right opportunities and all the right opportunities through the whole research cycle. So from grant development into publication. So now that I've kind of set the tone, I think what's really important is that we get to know lived experience a little bit more. What's been really lacking in the past is, I guess, a sense of visibility and a lack of understanding about what that spectrum of lived experience really encompasses, even when we're looking at individuals who might fit the diagnostic criteria for quite complex or kind of scary diagnoses, including those that have psychotic diagnoses. So it's really important that we understand as well a little bit about the language. So this is, as I said, a little bit about learning to speak my language, learning to speak the lived experience language. So I want to be really clear about how I just define a few things as we get going. So when I say someone has lived experience, well, we all have lived experience. When I say it in this context, what I'm saying is that an individual has lived experience of mental health challenges, mental ill health, I would say mental illness for me, mental health symptoms, mental distress, emotional distress and trauma. And the reason I want to expand this out is because mental distress, emotional distress and trauma aren't always linked to mental illness. They often might be, but I think sometimes when we think about lived experience, we need to think more broadly, and we definitely need to think about individuals who experience trauma. People are often very traumatized by their own experience, and even though we might work and unravel our narratives and resolve our emotional feelings to this, one thing that stays stuck, I think, for a lot of people is the disruption to their nervous system, and this is one of the ways that that trauma actually affects us. And I'm really happy to talk more about that at another time, but I do bang on about trauma and the central nervous system a lot. So as I said, this is a lived experience. The other word that we often use that's synonymous is consumer. So when you hear lived experience and you hear consumer, they might be used interchangeably, and that's because they have very, very, very similar meanings, and it's only a couple of connotations that might be a little bit different. So when I think of the word consumer, this is quite a divisive word still amongst individuals with lived experience, but it often references an individual that has service use, might be using services or might use services in the future. And that's just a little nuance between the terms, but you'll find actually often that lived experience and consumer are quite often used interchangeably. Just want to clarify that so that we don't get confused as I swap between those two moving forward. The interesting thing about lived experience, and this is me, I think when I'm about 10, I used to have this in another presentation that I used to do, and I was halfway through the presentation and I realised that in the background there was a sign that says danger, keep away from the edge of the cliff. So I've just kind of kept that one. It's kind of Freudian, but I kind of like it. But if you think about what I would have been experiencing as that little girl, I was very safe within my family. I have a very accepting family. But there's no way that I could have foreseen all of the tragedies and all of the triumphs that that I was going to experience. And there was things that made it easier, like having other friends that had complex diagnoses that were moving on in their life. And there were things that made it much, much harder. For me, the thing that made mental illness the hardest was this stuff. was our cultural stories. So this was the baggage that that little girl brought through her life. So these are three of the most iconic images that we have, that I have to think about the stories that I brought with me into my experience. So we have, of course, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was actually written by a mental health consumer, reflecting upon his time in an asylum. But really, I often find that this is the most striking image that we pull from that movie, and it's done, I think, a profound amount of damage. And it's made experiences like mine very difficult. The other thing that we have, I'm pretty sure this one in the middle was a picture taken a couple of years ago. I'm pretty sure this is Larundel. This is definitely Melbourne. This is one of our old asylums. So I'm born in 82. In 82, we're still under the Lunacy Act. In 86, we come out of the Lunacy Act, and we say that we're going to get rid of the asylums, but we're not really prepared for the level of support that we're going to need to integrate people back into the community. I've worked with individuals, obviously, who haven't had experiences of being in the asylum, and I have worked with individuals who have been institutionalised. And it's like two different groups of people. The impact of institutionalisation is just phenomenal. But most of all, growing up in the 80s and the 90s, you just knew that it was bad to go crazy. That's what happened to other people, and that if it happened to you, that was pretty much the end of it. And more than that, it was also really shameful. So this is a slide that represents, I've come through with these cultural stories, and my cultural story that I held after my inpatient mission was that there was no hope for me moving forward. I previously had my own arts collective and worked as a curator, so I was previously a really high achiever. And this is the deadest time I've ever had in my life because there is nothing to do. I watched the news 5 times every day. I would go to sleep at 9 a.m. not because I was tired. I was just really sick of being awake. Every day was the same. I couldn't go out because I was profoundly agoraphobic. I had to move back from Melbourne to Geelong, which is also a profoundly shameful thing to happen. I'd lost all my friends because drug dealers don't call ambulances, and they don't visit you after you've gone into an inpatient unit either. I lost everything, and I thought it was all over. When we go on to talk about recovery and we talk about the function of hope, if you don't have hope in this instance, if I didn't have people that challenge that narrative, I would still be there. I'd be in Corio in my mockos without a job. I would have just completely given up. For me, that's all it would have taken. I was really lucky that I only had positive service experiences and I had a great psychiatrist. The turning point for me that really blew my mind was when he said to me, he's like, we're pretty sure you're going to be okay. And I'm like, this cannot be. I've been in an inpatient unit. He's like, look, out there'll be an accountant and he'll be hearing voices, but he'll still be adding everything up and get it right. People are out there in the community who are having mental health experiences and they're still doing things, and it's going to be okay. And I really needed that. When I came out, I moved back home to my old house where my housemate's father had the diagnosis of bipolar. So it was just kind of really normal. I met a new best friend who has the diagnosis of schizoaffective, and she was about a year ahead of me. So I got to watch a potential recovery journey happening for me right in front of my eyes. And it took that for me to start to change and challenge the ideas about what was possible for myself. But yeah, we nearly didn't have a consumer academic. We nearly had someone sitting on a couch in Crow. Those stories are so powerful. So I want to come and talk about the idea of recovery, because this is something that I see where there's a disharmony often between what researchers are expecting recovery to be about and what clinicians expect recovery is about. I'm going to challenge you to just think about the fact, because we all know the really basic definition of that release as well. But for me, what recovery really is just really simple. The concept of recovery provides a boundary in which it's no longer possible to invalidate a person due to the actual or perceived experience of mental illness or distress. So for me, recovery is actually a boundary. And from within that boundary, what it means in real life to me when it functions is that it doesn't matter how well I am or how unwell I am, I'm always still in recovery. So an example that I used to use was whether I'm giving you a lecture as, you know, Dr. Catherine Mitchell, or I am in seclusion. I am no more or no less in recovery in either of those situations. It is a constant. It is the air around me. It is about the way I relate to my life, and I relate to what is possible for me. Recovery is a personal journey. So sometimes when we work in services, you'll see things like recovery plans, which they kind of co-ops the idea of recovery by situating it as something in which there must be progression in order to be valid, when really, as I said, recovery is a state which cannot be invalidated. And you do not need to move forward if you do not want to. And sometimes I think when you understand some of the complex experiences that people have been through, that if they don't want to move forward, they just want to hunker down and be safe for a bit, that to me, that just seems to make a lot more sense. There's room for us to grow our compassion there. As I said, yeah, it's something that can't be taken from you. It's something that doesn't belong to your case manager, your mum, your brother, or anyone who wants you to be different. This is a space in which you don't need to be different. You are valid just the way you are. And it's a space in which, if you choose to, you can start to think about, plan about good things that you'd like to have in your life and the possibility of having that. And that would be the core of what my work was in community mental health. So I'm going to welcome you to, I guess, breaking down a little bit about who our lived experience helpers could be in research, who our partners could be. So then again, thinking, using that broad banner of lived experience, I've broken it down into 3 categories that might be helpful to think about as researchers. So that is consumers. And so when I've used the word consumers here, it's kind of denoting the fact that they might be ex-service users, current service users, and maybe even future service users. So these are really important individuals to have as research participants. So for example, I'm also in another RCT where we're looking at smoking cessation and cutting down. So if the research question is, out of these 2 options, which one's more effective? We need to, and we're looking at this specific population, then we need to, it makes good sense that we need to, from a technical point of view, to test it and evaluate it with these people. So that's what we're doing. So one of the places that we can have is consumers as research participants. Another place that we might want to consider partnering with individuals with lived experience is in advisory groups and committees. So I'm doing a couple of other evaluations where, so we're doing one in the ACT, for example, or an evaluation of the Recovery College, where we have a co-chair who is one of the consumers from that organisation. And that's really helpful. And sometimes researchers don't understand why that's really helpful. And I used to say to our other peer workers, it's because consumers have got the goss. Like, we know the ins and outs. We know why we like to do some things and why we don't like to do other things. And you can just get, you can just save so much time and improve the effectiveness of your research if you just ask people who are likely to be participants or are from the setting that you're in, so that you just get the nuances that you couldn't know as an outside researcher. So that's a really important space to have participation. Another group of people is peer workers. So this is a bit of my vocab upskilling if you haven't heard that phrase before. A peer worker is an individual who has lived experience but is in a professional role. And they often have professional qualifications as well as peer support work training. or other training as well. So this includes people like peer support workers. Peer support workers do direct practice, so they do face-to-face support. So for example, we worked a lot with one of the ED peer support workers at St. Vincent's for our Peers in ED project. And his job was to go and to meet people who were waiting in ED who they'd identified as having mental distress, and to support them through that ED journey. You also get this in clinical and in community as well. So this is a real growing workforce. Another group of people that you might run into is consultants. So as I said, I have a consultancy practice, and I have for a number of years. And what that allows me to do is not only just to have the experience of running my own project, it also lets me do work where I'm working between industry, lived experience, and research as well, because I find that there's actually often a large gap between research and industry as much as the other way around, and I'm really happy to talk about that in length at another time. Another place that you might run into that you might want to have is peer worker managers. So at the moment, Melbourne, as I understand it, Melbourne has a peer worker manager meeting. The fact that we've got peer worker managers through our hospitals now is incredible. We often really struggle to have positions where we can move up in an organisation. We often struggle and often don't have things like team leaders and senior leaders that are actually peers as well. So this is a growing workforce, and if there's anyone interested in research on that, you're welcome to contact me. The other space that we have is educators. I've worked as an educator. I taught Cert 4 in mental health and in peer support work. It's really important to have individuals with lived experience teaching this, because we can do things like help people understand recovery and recovery journeys straight off the bat before they go into practice. We also have advocates, which will champion for positive change, policy advisors, that's pretty self-explanatory. And last but not least, we have individuals working in research. So we have research assistants, and we can have consumer academics as well. It would be wonderful if we had more room for consumer academics throughout our universities. It's a real point of growth. Currently, at the moment, there's just a handful of people doing what I do. So that will be something we can support. And last but not least, again, is individuals who are in non-identified roles who might have lived experience. I'm just putting that out there, so I don't want to leave them out, and I can talk about that another day. So if we were thinking about ways in places and spaces in which we could have better involvement of individuals with lived experience, I've done just this little bit of a timeline. It's a bit rough. It's not comprehensive. It's just to give us a space in which to talk. So as you can see, when we think about our cycle of research development, so from prior to starting the grant to all the way through towards finishing the project and starting to complete the next grant, that's the cycle that we want to work with consumers through, that whole cycle. I'm going to give you a really good example. I was very, very lucky at the University of Melbourne to work with Lisa on an exceptional project called Peers in EDs. And Peers in EDs was looking at developing guidance and elements so that if we were to put peer support workers, so those direct practice people, into the ED, that we would have an understanding of the supports and the things required to make that possible. So that was the project we had. That was our research problem. And the aim of our project was to develop an approach to implementing peer support workers in the emergency department. So we'll go through each of these steps and look at the ways that we included lived experience individuals the whole way through. And if we missed any opportunities, we can have a look at that too. So the first phase is actually often a phase where I see that people have missed out on involving consumers, and it's such a shame because it's such a make or break phase of a project. And that's within developing the concept of the research project. So quite often anyone who reads mental health kind of literature will see that individuals aren't included in the concept. In fact, they might not be included anywhere along this whole timeline. Within the Peers NEDs project, we were very, very lucky to have a very, very well-known, very knowledgeable senior lived experience advisor on our team, and he was situated at Minds Australia, which is also where I used to work. I think is quite progressive in their consumer values. And it was actually his idea that really kicked it off and said that this is something that we should be looking at. And from that, we started to develop, they started to develop a broader team. So the important thing here is that it was actually a consumer-driven project. The next thing that's important is that it was consumer-driven with allies. When I say allies, what I mean is individuals who support work, lived experience work, and support consumers and share and agree with and are in alliance with a lot of their values. So mutuality, respect, equanimity. And so we actually developed quite they developed quite a powerful team. And as I said before, that it's really important that if you don't have individuals at the concept phase from lived experience, you could define a problem incorrectly, or you could miss some of the nuances, especially if you haven't had practice experience. There is a risk there, and there's a risk there that the end product might not be valued by lived experience people, or it could be seen as counterproductive. They're the big scary ones. But it is so important to have it at that conceptual level. Often we only tend to bring it in the past a little bit later. The next phase, which is really important, that Richard kind of mentioned in the introduction, which is involving, and this is often an area again where lived experience people get left out, and that's in the development of the grant. So in that evolution out of the concept into kind of the grants phase. And one of the areas where lived experience often gets left out of within grants is in terms of being AIs and CIs. And in that respect, I think it's really important that we develop more opportunities for people to come up the academic ladder so that they are eligible to be AIs and CIs. And I see this as a real area of growth moving forward. What was really special about the Peers and ED's proposal was that it made allowances for growing and developing the lived experience workforce. So one of the things it had a proviso for a full scholarship to the University of Melbourne for an individual, preferably with lived experience, and it was awarded to someone with lived experience. And this is important because it means that although the project finished after about a year, that there's still that ongoing development enrichment from lived experience back into the research community. And hopefully individuals like that will then go on to be our AIs and our CIs and our leaders. The other thing that was already written into the proposal was that there would be a consumer academic. And that's actually the role that I applied for and that I was awarded as well. So I wasn't here during the grant stage, but my role was, and I was just lucky enough to join the team. And we also had, as you can see, this really diverse team of individuals from industry and from academia. So in terms of the rollout, or as we might think of it, the conduct of the research, it was really important that Peers and EDs actually had a really multifaceted approach to including individuals with lived experience. So we had individuals already on the research team. We had them on the expert panel. In fact, I think the expert panel had about 20 people, and of which half of those individuals had lived experience, and we also had carers as well. We also had a series of focus groups. So we had one of our focus groups was specifically for consumers, one was specifically for carers, and the other one was for ED staff. So consumers and carers are able to give us two very different perspectives from which to address this problem. And we also included PSW, which is short for peer support workers. So individuals who do direct practice in an identified lived experience role, and we had 11. It's really important to note, because in the past there's been criticisms around tokenisms, that within this project, the nitty-gritty and the hard work was often done by individuals with lived experience. They weren't just there to badge their name on at the end. So I did a lot of the organising and the project management for the teams. So it meant that all of those little details were done with peer worker sensibilities. It also meant that things like the review of things like reviews of evidence, which I actually did for a different project, sorry, but it's still really important, is an important area where lived experience people can contribute. I conducted the research activities and we had a PhD. So number 4 is in the write-up. The write-up is a space where individuals with lived experience haven't always been the writers. We're not always held the pen to writing our own story. In this project, I was the main author for the report, and I expect that I'll be doing again most of the writing for a peer review. So that's really about remembering and raising our expectations of individuals with lived experience, and to find ways to upskill and encourage people to develop the skills for publishing, and not just writing, but in terms of writing back to reviewers, and in terms of actually entering, actually putting your manuscripts through the interface or the platform for publishing. So these are my references. If you have anything that you're specifically interested in, I encourage you to write back to me. You're welcome to get my email through Richard, should you fail to take it down at this point. And I just want to remind you again that it's really important what we do and what we say as researchers. It says a lot about us when we include or don't include individuals with lived experience. And it's just really important because we're adding to that discourse around expectation that people can really take on board, and it can be so determining in people's lives. And if we think back to that early picture that we saw of me by the cliff, that the only difference in my outcome was the fact that I had people there that could balance off that narrative around what it meant to have an illness and what it meant for my future. Sometimes as scientists, we can lose sight of who we want to help, and sometimes the way we talk about things is a little unhelpful. So here I am in my first day of school, and here I am in my first year of my PhD, and that's all I've got.
You look very, very young in your first day of school, Catherine.
I'm a bit worried about the haircut, but that's okay.
It would have been the almost the 90s.
Oh, you're very kind. Maybe 87.
I recently did see a picture of me from when my first day of school, which was the 1960s. Always deeply, deeply regret the 1960s. Catherine, thank you very much for your presentation. It was incredibly thoughtful and illuminating. I've written lots of notes down, but perhaps if colleagues have got questions, then I can either I can transfer them to you, or people can ask. Jack, you've written something down. Do you want to ask your question, or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi. Sorry, I was just unmuting myself.
That's cool.
First of all, just thank you very much for that presentation. That was excellent. Yeah, great to hear about that subjective lived experience. It's an area I work in too, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how can we report or I guess explain how people were involved, because it's something I'm working on. How can you do that in a standardized way? So I've shared a link because I thought it might be interesting to yourself and perhaps other people on this chat, and an invitation for anyone to get involved in that work. So please do read that message. But in the interest of time, just it's hoping to just spark a discussion about ways people know about reporting involvement, and also co-producing the labels we use to describe people. You know, who self-identifies as a consumer, or do people self-identify as a person? Those sorts of discussions, and how can we standardize that? Anyway, I've talked too long, so that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Jack. So the first thing that I would do, because everybody's different and everyone has different sensibilities, is to ask people how they'd like to be identified. And you can report that you've asked people how they want to be identified. The second thing is that you could, depending on what you wanted to do, have people write. It's really good if you've got someone with lived experience who can write how that involvement was conducted. So, for example, in the past, me and Kath Roper have done a consumer commentary. But I think that there is something really interesting if you've got people who have been on the committee, or you've had a researcher, if you let them author that in their own words, it shows a great level of authenticity. But I think you can kind of capture it that way. The other thing as well, one of my first things that I was ever asked to do towards just before I started my PhD was by the University of Melbourne, and it was about reporting lived experience in research projects. And at that time, they would say things like, consumers have been consulted. If you're only giving 4 words in a 4,000 word article to that level of consultation, it doesn't convey a great deal of interest or a great deal of valuing of what's being contributed. So I think you need to give it enough space and enough words, and consider having it worded by consumers.
Catherine, have the BMJ been at the kind of, I think they've been very good, because if you submit a paper to the BMJ, they kind of demand that you show how consumers or service users were involved in the research. And I've always thought that's been quite an impressive thing. As in, if you don't demonstrate kind of consumer involvement, your paper is not going to get published. And I think it's a great sort of motivator to drive that level of involvement. I don't know if you've got thoughts.
It's a bit by hook or by crook, and it's the same with grants as well, because we all now know that you wouldn't go for a grant without having some form of consumer input in there. And that's where we run into problems around tokenism, which is when people are doing things to meet an end as opposed to doing it from an authentic understanding of why consumers should be included. And that's just something to be watched. The worst thing that you could ever have happen to you at a lived experience attended conference is to be called token, because if they feel like you don't get it. So it is really actually about having a bit of a power differential where researchers used to design, implement, and report, and it's about kind of giving back a little bit of that power to consumers in a very respectful way, and in developing that understanding of why what they know is so important. Because I think that's something we miss in research is we know we have to do it to get into BMJ, we know we have to do it to get a grant, but why is it so important that we talk to these people, or that we talk to any other population as well?
So do you perceive that those kind of behavioural mechanisms are a good thing? I guess I kind of think you need those mechanisms to sort of pushing something up the hill, pushing a rock up the hill.
I certainly don't not support them. It kind of reminds me of the Democrats' whole thing where we'll keep the bastards honest. We'll make sure that you do it. But if you're not meeting those benchmarks in meaningful ways, you're not really enriching your research anyway. So it is about actually developing that much broader understanding about our own experience and why these experiences are valuable not just to get a grant, but because they make for better research and because they make for research that people want to use.
Yes, yeah, it's you doing it because doing it makes things better, not doing it so that you get the.
And you can just tell the difference. Like as a consumer, you just go, okay, well, you know, you've slipped all that in there, but but I can tell from the way you talk, from your sensibilities, from how you've decided what is true, that you actually don't care what I think or what I say or what my experience is. You think you're right. And it's that real for me, I have this thing around learning to talk other people's languages. So I extended myself to learn to speak better or understand quantitative sensibilities much more in my PhD. And it's about researchers coming in and being humble and valuing that things that we know are really important and that they're true. And that it might just be the way we decide what's true based on our paradigm that's making the difference.
Agreed.
So we often get that between quant and qual. If you ever watch that, where someone with quantitative thinks that something's not the true answer and qualitative doesn't think that the quantitative strategy is the real answer, and it's actually just that the paradigms are different and they're not understanding each other's perspectives or sensibilities. It's a bit like that.
Yes. Lisa Brophy, Lisa, you've made a couple of comments. Do you want to ask or kind of reiterate the points that you've made, because they're good points?
Yeah, I think I just want to congratulate Catherine on such a wonderful, generous presentation. And I think, you know, a couple of things that I mentioned in the chat is, you know, that sometimes also it's really important to make sure that people aren't doing this as a single person on a project, or and that's where lived experience advisory panels have actually been really good, because you may only be able to employ, you know, one researcher on your project, but having them then have a group that's behind them that they can use to consult with, and who also then can be brought in, is actually really helpful. But I think in general, we'd like to sort of see people employed in pairs, but then you have this problem that Catherine was talking about them employing people part-time and all the problems that are associated with that. So, you know, you really need to have that very thoughtful approach, I think, to making sure that people aren't trying to do this in a solitary kind of way. That's actually really important. And hopefully building up more networks over time. We'll see more networks developing across the uni as well, which would be great.
And the other thing as well, extending on what Lisa said, is that the consumer experience and perspective is so diverse that if you only have one person's point of view, you're really missing that true richness of diversity, which is where I think the consumer perspective is strongest.
What are there other questions for Catherine? Because I was just going to drift into another question, which is rude. I might drift into another question. What can because the university is kind of going through, whatever the university is, the university is kind of going through a planning for research 2030, and you can see all the usual targets appearing in a research strategy. We need more money, we need more publications, they need to be better publications. How and where should consumer involvement be reflected in the strategy? Should it be something that kind of runs through that strategy, and how do we achieve that as a kind of research community?
I think it should run all the way through, but that also comes down to maybe ideas around access and development. So if we want to have consumer academics run all the way through and hold all these complex positions and stuff through the university, we have to have people come in through the bachelor, through their honours, through their PhD in order to do so. So we might need to look at how we support and encourage individuals with lived experience to progress through the university. And the other thing as well is it's always up to about what the individual wants to choose. Not everybody wants to work in research or be a researcher. It's a really difficult career. There's lots of instability. There's a lot of stress. I always say it's good. It shows me that someone's got good mental health if they don't want to work in research. So it is still about looking for those individuals and identifying those individuals that have an interest in occupying these positions. So that it's really coming from the bottom up.
Yeah, it feels to me that it's not something that we talk enough. It feels to me that there's a real job to work harder on consumer involvement. And I think,
and we need to have the conditions that knowing that it's just speaking really generally across disciplines and across countries, it's such a tough industry, it's such a tough job to have, working in research in universities, making sure as well that we have all of the employment supports that an individual would need.
Jack's made a couple of important points. I don't know whether he would like to kind of make some comments out loud.
Thank you. I agree with everything being said, and I was just sort of, I think Australia needs to be aware of when they use the word consumer sort of internationally, you know, is that, going back to what Catherine was saying, is that a word people self-identify with? You know, are we all consumers of air pollution? Are we consumers of you know, cancer services? Are we users of services? And I think being very clear when you asked your question, Richard, about, you know, how does La Trobe integrate consumer involvement in its future research plan? I think, you know, we might want to talk more about sharing power in the research process, and how can we do that, and how can we be transparent about how research was planned and who was involved. So yeah, that's just a jump, but echoing everything that Catherine said. But yes, the question is how do we do that? And I think that's the developing international discipline that it's great to hear.
And the other thing that we have as well that could be considered is whether or not La Trobe is a safe space to disclose that you've had mental health experiences. So that then when you've got individuals, whether or not individuals feel safe self-identifying at the workplace and then being able to speak from that perspective.
Yeah, I agree.
If they chose.
Catherine, the chair only has two tasks. One is a bit of inane chatter at the beginning while people join, and to ensure that things are brought to a timely close, because everybody's on back-to-back Zoom meetings at the moment. If people aren't on back-to-back Zoom meetings, they should be. But can I thank you for your presentation, which was illuminating, stimulating, and challenging. It's been the best hour of my day. I've enjoyed it tremendously. Unless any of my PhD students are online, and I've supervised them today, in which case the hour that I spent with them was also very informative. But thank you very much. Greatly appreciate your time and work, which is fantastic. To colleagues who've come along, thank you very much. Much appreciated in giving up of your time, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.